So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to the next in the series of faction showcases, and today we will be having a look at the cruel HARAD of the south. And of course, in terms of factions that I would say they are similar to, maybe Rudal would be a pretty good place to start, because they do dip into the orc philosophy a little bit of having a lot of numbers, and they do tend to be quite aggressive. There are differences between the two, but probably in terms of similarities that is the best one to look at. Rune also, there are a few similarities there as well. But as we go through, they certainly have their own identity, and they are certainly quite popular as well among many players, for good reason as well. Starting off, of course, we will be taking a look at the siege equipment first of all, and there's nothing too impressive here. They've just got a standard ballista, and as we have a look over here, they have a standard catapult, which for HARAD in particular, they do have the numbers to defend them on an open field should you decide to go a little bit more defensive, but for the most part you will be noticing that HARAD will put a little bit more emphasis in terms of their infantry damage dealers rather than trying to rely on something like this to get the bulk of their kills, because obviously it can be a little bit risky if you're playing as a faction which can be skirmished with like HARAD can, to try and put your trust a little bit into an expensive unit like a basic catapult. But even so, in a siege obviously you will be seeing them on the defence and offence quite often. But moving into the infantry corps, which is where of course things start to gain their unique flavour for HARAD, we'll start off with the HARAD spearmen. And in terms of a sort of more militia-based unit, there's nothing too special about them. They do dip in, again, as I said previously, a little bit more into the orc philosophy. Their stats across the board tend to be a little bit lower than the equivalents from the good Kingdoms of Men, but they are cheaper to make up for this at 250. And of course, 204 men in the unit means that they are among the most numerous units in the game. They can also do skill trom and have a bonus fighting cavalry, so you cannot use them to sort of push your way through the lines in shield wall like you could do potentially with some of the other lower tier spears, like the Arnor spear, like the Arthurdane, no, not the Arthurdane spears, the Evandim spears I should say from Arthurdane. But nonetheless they can still be a bit of a sticking point and a good tar pit as well for you because of their sheer numbers, and of course the fact that they have that bonus against cavalry means you can use them as cannon fodder on the flanks as well, but they are essentially just a quintessential militia unit. Moving back, however, and we will start to get into a bit more of a unique HARAD flavour here, starting off with the Muhad warriors, which are the cheapest basic line infantry that you can mass up as HARAD, and they only cost 525 each. They have relatively low defensive values, and this mainly stems from the fact that they have limited armour values of 3, which all of the Muhad units will suffer from a lack of armour. Obviously they tend to wear sort of wooden slats for the most part, or no armour at all, and just go into battle shirtless. So we've got a bunch of bald-headed hooligans here. They do look very intimidating, however, but their attack value of 6 is actually higher than something like the Gondor infantry, for example. So they do trade in some defense for some attack, but for the most part individually they will be outperformed by stuff like the Gondor infantry, especially seeing as the Muhad warriors cannot have their armour upgraded. However, there are a lot of them per unit. 228 per unit means that they outstrip even the militia option for HARAD when they're on huge. So it is potentially something which you can use to really bog down the enemy. Obviously, the quality could come into play if your enemy has gone for some really heavy-duty quality, something like the Castamir's Legion. But the Muhad warriors will rarely steer you wrong, particularly if you're going up against the orcs, because they do have the numbers to sort of stand up to that fight very well. So they have been changed in recent times to make them a little bit more viable, and HARAD are no longer able to simply rely on their AP spears. Having said that, we do have the Muhad Beast Tamers, which are not armour piercing. They are a basic pike unit, and as a basic pike unit, the units that they have most in common with include the neighbouring Corsair pikemen from Umbar, or something like the Lake Town pikemen from the far north in Dale. Again, as far as these basic pikes go, they can be very, very effective, of course, if they can get their pikes down, because they can really stop units that are considerably more expensive than themselves for long periods of time, and if you can sort of keep a lot of the enemy's value bottled up fighting pikes, chances are you're going to win elsewhere in the field. But for the most part, you probably won't be seeing the Muhad Beast Tamers as much as some of the other options that HARAD have on display, simply because they aren't quite as effective. Nonetheless, they will still fulfill exactly the same role as the Lake Town pikes will, or the Corsair pikes will. So if you had a similar strategy in mind that you would use for either Dale or Umbar, you can just slot the Beast Tamers into the role that those pikes would carry in those armies. And they will do a job for you, but just bear in mind, of course, that they will do absolutely abysmally under arrow fire because of their very low armour score and their complete lack of a shield. Speaking of complete lack of a shield, of course, to round off these Muhard units in the melee infantry, we have these Muhard berserkers, which are of course an AP shock unit, effective against armour. This big bone club is essentially an axe, and attack of 11 and a charge bonus of 10 means that that's pretty good value, honestly, for 550. Some of the higher tier units don't have too much more than that, but obviously they really suffer for this in terms of defence. Only 6 total defence, defensive skill of 3, and a shield value of 0. So again, you could look at them as being quite similar to the Rudar Axemen, only slightly cheaper and without the ability to hide. 178 per unit does put them at lower than the Muhard Warriors, but equal with the Pikes. So again, if you want a bit of cheap AP in your front lines, you could use this, or you could use a unit which we'll get onto in just a moment, which most people will know HARAD for. Now, however, if you wanted to splash out a little bit more on your line infantry, you could punt for the Serpent Guard, which of course have been with us ever since vanilla, and I've always liked the look of the Serpent Guard, and obviously they have a look to them much more akin to the Good Kingdoms of Men and their basic infantry units, only their total defence is slightly lower than something like the Gondor infantry or the Minas Tirith Lyn swordsmen, but their attack is slightly higher. An attack of 7 with those scimitars is pretty decent, so you'll be able to carve your way through trash no problem at all. 163 men in the unit means there are significantly less of them than the Muhard Warriors. But they will also stand up to arrow fire a little bit better because of their heightened armour values, although they do have a lower shield value, so that is worth bearing in mind. But this is one of the, well, in terms of their infantry, this is the only unit that HARAD can upgrade the armour of, and this gives them the Black Serpent unit model, so of course this is going to be a very difficult unit to break down. If you wanted to go a little bit more front heavy in terms of your infantry, if you're expecting to face someone like Angmar, for example, which 9 times out of 10 are really going to bring the heat in terms of infantry, then something like this will not steer you far wrong. However, the unit which HARAD really became known for in the base version of 0.96 was the Southron Warband, because of course in a very similar vein to the Heavy Goblin Spears, they are basic spears that are AP. They can form shield wall, of course they have that bonus fighting cavalry, but it's the effectiveness against armour which really gives them their cost efficiency, because obviously armoured units will not do too well against a unit like this, although they have had their unit numbers reduced and you can only bring 2 before the cost increases now. So in a very similar vein to the, well, it might be 3 actually, just like the Heavy Goblin Spears, but regardless, they are not quite as ever present in the Haradrim line as they would otherwise have been. They do have some discrepancies in terms of their stats. Their defense values are not very good, their armor value is not fantastic compared to basic spears from other factions, and their shield value is not particularly great either. But if you can saturate your line with this sort of AP, then you can often find yourself in a very good position, because unlike the Muhard Berserkers, they won't fizzle out as quickly, and you can use them in a much more defensive fashion. In a very similar vein as well, we have the other unit which kind of fit into this as well, and that is the Southron Pikemen. I don't know if they're the only AP pike in the game. They might be, and you might be thinking that's quite OP, especially for a unit that only costs 600, but again, they are very limited in the amount you can bring, and their stats are honestly pretty dreadful. I mean, most pikes in the game are going to have better stats than this, and you might be thinking that stats don't matter as much with pikes, and you're kind of correct, but as soon as you can get around these pikes and circumvent their formation, they'll fall apart very, very quickly, and HARAD do need to protect them, but of course, at the end of the day, they are AP pikes, so if you can get them into a good fighting position, particularly if they're in a choke point, for example, in a siege, they can do very, very good for you. But they are also very vulnerable to arrows. Slightly more armour than the Muhard units, but not enough to mitigate any decent amount of arrow pressure. Now, getting into some of HARAD's slightly higher tier toys when it comes to their infantry, we will start off with the Hashari, which are the assassin units for HARAD, and they share quite a lot in common with the Thieves of Tharbad in the sense that they are, I think, a little bit better than the Thieves of Tharbad, but they cost like 25 florins more. Obviously very highly skillful infantry at 19 defensive skill. Terrible armour, so as soon as they reveal themselves from their hiding position, they will of course get shot up really badly by most things. But if you get them into a good sort of blob fight against units which really can't break through that defensive skill of 19, they're obviously going to get a lot of kills. But you do need to be careful with them because they are quite expensive, and assassins are always a bit of a risk. They will either pay off for you massively or fizzle out without doing a great deal, so you do need to build your army around using them effectively if you intend to bring the Hashari, particularly against a ranged focused faction. The slightly more dependable unit on this line, although significantly more expensive, are the Trollmen of HARAD. Again, another unit which has been with us ever since vanilla. Cost 1,000 each, but then they do have multiple HP. Their chanting inspires nearby troops. Bonus fighting cavalry, effective against armour, frighten nearby enemy infantry. They've got all of the good stuff that you would want from a unit that costs 1,000. Now when you look at them, they don't have fantastic armour values, which is the slight chink in their armour. So potentially, under enough arrow fire, particularly from the side or back, they will start to fall apart very, very quickly. but chances are if you've got arrows shooting into the back of your line, you're probably going to lose no matter what unit is there. An attack of 12 is also not huge, but it is better than most other sword and board units can manage, particularly as they're effective against armour. Again, one of the very few units in the game that is a sword and board unit and also AP. Very, very popular unit for HARAD, and they do really help hold down the centre of your line, and the fear that they cause is definitely definitely doesn't go amiss either against orcs or someone like Cardler. The one unit which can be considered Uber tier or General's Bodyguard tier that HARAD have in terms of their infantry are the Champions of Neferat, and I essentially look at them as being super versions of Trollmen. They've got better stats across the board, lower shield values. They are actually in a way more vulnerable to arrows, but they also inspire nearby troops to a good extent, so that will help to keep some of your lower tier units in line, which of course HARAD being a little bit more borrowing of their tactics from the orcs, they can suffer from morale shocks a little bit. So a unit like this right in the middle can certainly help things, obviously effective against armour, right nearby enemy infantry as well. And that defensive skill is decent, but it can be overridden by quite a few. But they are effectively a multiple HP shock troop, considering they are effective against armour, so despite the fact they have these two-handed swords, although they are serrated, a better comparison for them would be something like the Tharbad Warhammers, for example, rather than the multiple HP swordsmen like the Elisar's Vanguard. But very, very good in a blob fight, but again, they can be focused down if that is what you want to do. So now we shall move on to the archers and cavalry that the Black Serpents can bring to the field. So some elements of this certainly stand out a little bit, but before we get on to HARAD's very obvious mounted units, we shall start off with their skirmishers, which for the most part there isn't really anything too interesting to talk about here until we get to one unit in particular. But we will start off with the Haradrim archers, which again borrow very heavily from the orc school of thinking of just bury the enemy beneath as many arrows as you can get downfield as possible. Only cost 475, which is very cheap for an archer, very few can match that cost. But obviously their stats are pretty woeful. No shield, arm value of 2. You don't really expect these guys to come back from the field alive. If you want to really try and whittle down your opponent in the opening skirmish phase, then bringing a couple of these guys is not a bad idea, and I think you'll probably see them quite often, to be honest with you, with how useful cheap archers can really be. But other than that, there's nothing really unique about them to talk about, other than the fact that they are very similar to something like even the Goblin archers would be a pretty good comparison to these guys. No, wait, the Goblin archers can't hide anymore either, so yeah, almost one-to-one in many ways. But over here we have something which is slightly more beefy. If you wanted to go for the Southron archers, they do have a little bit more in terms of their armour, also they have a bit more in terms of their missile attack. They do cost a little bit more, but honestly this is an archer which isn't really going to set the world on fire either. HARAD can blanket the field with their lower tier skirmishers, and honestly that is a very viable way to do things as the game stands. You don't necessarily need to have a super high tier selection of archers in order to be competitive in terms of the skirmish. All you need to do is field enough archers to make it difficult for your opponent to get cost efficiency off them. So you can force your opponent to come to you if you want with HARAD, but it is potentially risky because some of your infantry units may rely a little bit more on having the numbers advantage. But even so, the Southron archers can hold their own. They obviously will lose to some of the beefier archers, but you can compensate from that by simply having more archers than the enemy will bring. Now HARAD have always had a bit of a thing for javelins, and this is where we will see our first javelin unit, and that is the Muhard Beast Hunters. Something of a basic javelin. Again, this is where some of the comparisons to Rune are going to come in quite handy, because they have a little bit in common with the Balchoth tribesmen in terms of how effective they are. Now they are effective against armour and melee because they do pull out little maces, which can be something which a lot of people miss actually. So again, adding a little bit to HARAD's AP repertoire, which is something they do have a good deal of effectiveness with. So unlike a few other javelins of a similar tier, when they run out of ammunition they can be a little bit more useful depending on the opponent that you're facing down. But it's a nice little detail. But other than that, obviously missile attack of 8, which is armor piercing projectiles. Not really a lot else to say other than the fact that they are basic javelins. Moving on, we will see a ranger unit for HARAD, and that is going to be the Hashari Shadows. Now, it used to be actually that not the Hashari Shadows, the Hashari Stalkers I should say. It used to be that these guys were identical to the melee Hashari, only 100 florins more expensive and having a missile attack. Now that has changed considerably since those times. They are not as good in melee as the fully melee focused Hashari. They're still not half bad though. Defensive skill of 14 and a melee attack of 11. Basic infantry is not really going to want to fight up against something that's got 14 melee skill. But really the main attraction here is of course the body piercing projectiles that rangers have. And in this vein they are the same as most others. Missile attack of 5, body piercing projectiles, not a huge amount of men in the unit, but they can hold their own a little bit better in melee perhaps than several other units of rangers, which is perhaps a unique selling point for them. Then the final skirmisher we have for HARAD is probably one of the most feared skirmishers in the game, and that is the Demons of the Desert, and that comes from the fact that they are probably the single most devastating javelin unit in the game. They maintain their thrown projectile trait, although considering the fact that HARAD are the ones with the Mumakil, that will rarely ever really come into effect, but they can also really devastate enemy formations. Men often go flying when the Demons of the Desert throw their projectiles into a densely packed line. Obviously they have that bonus against cavalry. I think they count as two-handed spears in melee, so you don't want to leave your cavalry in sustained melee with them for too long. They're also effective against armour, they frighten nearby enemy infantry, and they're not bad in melee either. They're not quite as ridiculous as they once were, where they used to be real powerhouses in melee at one point. But now 1100 is a pretty fair price for them, because they can be overpowered in melee by a decent unit, but they do have 2 HP, so you definitely need to be on the lookout for them. But they can't stand up to arrow fire too well, and they cannot hide, so that is also something worth considering, and only an arm value of 3, so you really want to keep them for the late game, and then they will possibly get you over the line if that is what you indeed want it to do. Now we shall move on to the cavalry, which I'm sure most people are just waiting to have a look at the Mumakil, but we'll start off with some of the more basic HARAD cavalry, and we'll start off with the Southron Lancers, which are essentially just cheap lancers. They have a charge bonus of 10, obviously, which is arm piercing. If you wanted to go for a more mounted HARAD focused army, you can do that. I would caution against it against certain factions that are perhaps a little bit more comfortable going for more cavalry, but HARAD can certainly do that. If you wanted to try and overwhelm the enemy by attacking them from many different angles, I've had success at doing that in the past, and the Southron Lancers are a big part of that, simply because they give you the numbers to do so, and obviously their charge can be pretty lethal simply because of their AP. Obviously they're not fantastic in sustained melee, though. They'll get butchered by most other cavalry, even other higher quality lancers in a sustained fight. However, if you wanted to splash out a little bit more on slightly higher quality lancers, you have the Serpent Guard, which are of course essentially just better lancers in every way, better stats across the board, but most importantly a higher charge bonus, which is still AP of course, but they also have higher armour, and they've got that nice shield value as well, which means that they're going to be more resilient all round. So you do pay for that. However, 825 is quite a lot of cash to splash out for just a little bit of insurance against mismanagement, but even so, the Serpent Guard are a mainstay of the HARAD line. And then finally, in terms of just sort of standard melee cavalry, we have the Black Serpent Bodyguards, which are multiple HP lancers, and again, looking at these guys, they are essentially just better versions of the standard Serpent Guard, but the most significant changes, they inspire nearby troops a considerable amount more in terms of defense, and I think most of that comes from the defensive skill. Indeed it does, but obviously they also have 2 HP, so the defensive skill means they will actually hold their own against anything other than the best spear cavalry and of course melee cavalry. But really, you know, the Black Serpents are swift enough to the point where you really shouldn't be getting them caught too often, but you know, a good micro touch is going to be needed to get the most out of them, but they look fantastic as well. I really like the Black Serpent unit model. Now we shall move on to the mounted skirmishers, of which HARAD do have a few. There is only one horse archer in this, however, and that is the Haradrim Raiders. This is another comparison that can be made to Rune and their Variag mercenary riders. They are horse archers, but they are not particularly high quality horse archers. They only cost 650. Missile attack of 5 isn't terrible, but their other stats means they're going to be zoned out by enemy foot archers relatively easily, and even other enemy horse archers are not really going to have too much of a problem dispatching them. Good harassment tool, but do bear in mind that they aren't the finest horse archers, but it does give HARAD that additional little bit of support from range, and giving them that extra bit of mobility which HARAD can potentially use to their advantage. Other than that, well actually they do have another horse archer, what am I talking about? We do have these Muhad Beastmasters, however, which are I think the only camel unit in the game as it stands. Camels, I've never really seen the scare horses trait be all that important in Medieval 2, if I'm being brutally honest, but they are still a pure anti-cavalry tool in many ways, simply because they are javelin cavalry, obviously, so they've got that effectiveness against armour, those close range armour piercing missiles. Their stats are not fantastic, their armour's poor, their shield value's not great, but using them to really help win that cavalry fight is really going to be their primary purpose. You're going to be relying on them actually to win the cavalry fight most of the time if you're going into a fight against some of the more western kingdoms of men that have got their armoured knights. These guys are going to be very important. The other horse archer though, I very rudely forgot about them. They can hide anywhere, so maybe that's why we have the Hashari Shadows, and These guys are somewhat unique. There is another unit which is their equivalent on the Good Kingdoms of Men that we haven't got to yet, but the Hashari Shadows are mounted rangers, and they have a missile attack of 5, but these are body-piercing projectiles, so they can be absolutely lethal, of course. They are expensive at 900, and of course, unlike the melee, well, the footbound variant down there, the Hashari Stalkers, the Hashari Stalkers can hold their own in melee against other infantry. Now, this is not going to be the case with the Hashari Shadows against almost all of the other sort of genuine melee cavalry in the game. I mean, they do have a defensive skill of 14, but against melee cavalry with that bonus against cavalry, it's often not going to end too well for the Hashari Shadows. Definitely a risky unit to bring, but if you look after them, if you can get them sort of positioned right along the axis of your enemy's line, you're going to be able to do tons of damage, and obviously it's easier to position a unit like this that can move quickly into that position where you can fire right along the enemy lines. But again, just like the Demons of the Desert, I would recommend that this is a unit that you're probably going to be saving to at least the mid-game, to when your enemy has committed most of their cavalry to the point where you can really get it into the right position, but potentially devastating, but even more risky than footbound rangers. And then the final 2 units, the War Beasts. To start off with, we've got, oh, that guy's club. Actually, no, that's the server blade from Dark Souls. We will start off with the Rhinos, which are the Muhad War Beasts. Now, this is another unit which, on the face of things, doesn't seem particularly fantastic, considering that there are only 16 of them, and they are essentially Lancers in a way. I mean, they are effective against armour off the charge bonus of 20, frighten nearby enemy infantry. They may run amok. It is worth saying that these guys do have locked morale, so the only way that you can get them to quote-unquote break is to get them to run amok by using fire arrows or simply surrounding them enough to the point where they do run amok. Now, total defense of 20, armour of 8 is not bad for a HARAD unit, honestly. Defensive skill of 12 is not amazing, but it could be worse, but it's the 3 hit points where they will really come good. If you get the right charge with the Muhad War Beast, you can devastate an enemy line, because obviously the mass on a unit like this is huge. It is difficult. I haven't seen them used to their full effect all that often, but when they have been used, it can be devastating. It's a similar thing really to the chariots, only I have seen the Muhad War Beast used to their full effect more than the chariots have, to be fair. But obviously, you know, risky, but in the right hands can be absolutely devastating. And then finally, we of course have the iconic Mumakil. Obviously their stats are absolutely outrageous across the board. 10 hit points, recruitment cost of 2,000. I'm not really sure what to say about the Mumakil, because they kind of stand alone as an entity within the game. They inspire nearby troops, which, I mean, obviously you'd be inspired by this. They frighten nearby enemies, of course they do. They have those missile attacks as well, which is very, very useful for just getting those extra kills on the approach. And now they are actually viable once again, considering that the not every javelin in the game can simply massacre them on sight. Only a select few are capable of doing that, and Khazad-dûm and HARAD are 2 that I know of. I think maybe Arthur Dane have one of them as well, Rune as well with their Balchot Sapphire Blazeman, but for the most part the Mumakil are going to be freed up and able to be used a little bit more often. Obviously you can use them to absolutely wreak havoc among your enemy's lines. You can smash holes in them and then charge forward with your infantry to try and make it so your enemy cannot reform. And of course in the midst of these more chaotic fights, then a unit which borrows a little bit more from the Orc philosophy, like HARAD, they're going to be able to take advantage of that more than other factions might be able to. But yeah, there isn't really much I can say about the Mumakil, simply because their stats and what they're used for is so out of kilter with anything else in the game. By this point, if you've been following me for any length of time, you will have seen the Mumakil by now in action, and now that the javelins have been sort of toned down a little bit in terms of being a hard counter, we should be seeing them a little bit more again as an effective force on the battlefield. But with that, that is all of the HARAD units, and we shall now go back to the army selection screen and talk a little bit more about what I think of HARAD as a whole. Much like the Misty Mountains, they've been toned down a little bit before 0.1 was released of the 0.96 patch, and that was for good reason, because you were simply able to bank up with all of your AP polearms, use your very cheap archers, and essentially just wait out the game, and there wasn't really much your opponent could do about it. It wasn't really a fun experience at all. But now that they've been sort of rebalanced and their armor-piercing polearms are still effective but not quite able to dominate the Haradrim roster as they used to be able to, and the fact that units like the Muhad Warriors and the Dismounted Serpent Guard have been made a little bit better, HARAD are now back to a position where I think they can be fun to play as and fun to play against. I do like HARAD. Obviously they are a little bit more attack focused in many of the things they have. Obviously almost all of their cavalry is focused around dealing heavy damage to the enemy's core, rather than trying to defend their own flanks with stuff like melee cavalry and spear cavalry. Obviously as well, stuff like the Muhad war beasts with that locked morale of 18, and of course the Mumakil are all business, they're all attack. You can play more defensively with HARAD, with obviously a lot of these lower tier archers with the javelins, and a lot of their units of course are very good on the defense, like the Southrons, and the Trollmen of HARAD can really do both, so that's nice. I think that HARAD have definitely earned their position as a bit of a fan favourite, simply because I feel as though their ability to be weirdly versatile, considering the fact that they are savage men which you expect to just charge across the open field mindlessly, but they have a lot more nuance to them than that, and indeed you can't afford to take too many risks because their pretty much universal lack of armour across their roster can be something which opponents can exploit very well. They can be vulnerable to arrows, but of course you can respond in kind by simply having a rush build where arrows are not going to be all that effective, or you can go for these cheap archers again and just try and skirmish with them and frustrate your enemy in terms of what they have decided to bring. I'm no expert when it comes to HARAD, or playing as HARAD I should say, but I've seen them used effectively often enough to know that when you have a player who really knows what they're doing, playing as HARAD, it can be a real nightmare, because as soon as part of your line starts to break, HARAD can really start to munch you up with all of the damage that they can do. And unlike Rudau, who are a little bit more reliant on their hand-thrown projectiles, HARAD do have a few more options in terms of their infantry in particular, which is a little bit more dependable now, especially with something like the upgraded Serpent Guard fighting alongside the Trollmen. That's a solid core, which any of the more defensive factions would be happy to see in their roster. So yeah, I like HARAD overall, and when it comes to the next overview, we're cycling back to the Orcs, and actually we've run out of Orcs other than one faction to do, so next up we will be taking a look at the Witch Realm of Angmar. And going from a faction which I consider to be quite versatile to one that is definitely put all their eggs into one basket, we could say. But yes, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for that, and presumably for a battle replay in between the two.